I would also say this is something that we're asked sometimes. Do I need a cover letter?
Mm.
No, don't need a cover letter. I
Thank you, Balaram, for joining me today. Really, really appreciate having you. Would you please tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Balaram Podar. I am a senior recruiter on the MBA student programs team, and I've been in the recruiting space now for 2 years, all at Amazon. But I've actually been at Amazon for 4 years, a little over 4 years. And interestingly, I joined Amazon through my MBA program. So I was on the other side of the table 4.5 years ago, and I joined through a program called RLD. That's our Retail Leadership Development Program. Spent my first almost 2 years as a senior product manager in the outdoor space in retail. So think about like all the different products you see on a store shelves. We have it separated like that in our retail business. And so I worked on outdoors and I worked on improving processes for getting new selection. And then had a short stint as a senior vendor manager in the Amazon Fresh space. And in that time moved from Seattle to New York. I'm currently in the New York area. But then since then, I decided, and this is something I love about Amazon, is you're really able to carve your own career path here. And so even though I was in technically a leadership development program, finishing my last year in that program, at the same time, I was kind of growing at Amazon in these different, more traditional business roles. I was discovering a passion for working more closely with people trying to get jobs,
Hmm.
doing pro bono career coaching, et
Yeah.
cetera. And so I decided to make the plunge into recruiting to just get a lot more insight and just have my goals tied to people getting jobs, being in that space, and I haven't looked back since. I've been really enjoying it.
So, as a senior recruiter for the MBA programs for Amazon, can you tell me just a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been on this team in particular for about a year now, and so there's a couple different dimensions to it. In the recruiting world, and I can speak specifically for Amazon, there's a couple different types of recruiters, but I'd say you can think of it broadly in two different buckets. So one would be a much larger bucket of industry recruiting. So think of that as a team such as yours or anyone else at Amazon, AWS, retail, wherever it is. They're expanding or they are backfilling, and so they need someone to fill that spot ASAP. So there's a recruiting team that is dedicated to that business. They work on finding that role through sourcing, through arranging those interviews, through closing candidates. So that's the larger bucket. This is a smaller bucket in terms of there's fewer of us in
Hmm.
student programs, but we work at scale. So we'll be hiring large amounts of student hires separated out by different types of jobs. So there's like a
Hmm.
tech student programs team that's maybe more focused on SDEs, et cetera.
Hmm.
And then there's like non-technical where there's undergraduate and then graduate. So
Hmm.
I work on the graduate side that uh, basically translates primarily to MBAs,
Hmm.
which is funny because that's how I joined.
Hmm.
And so what I do in that space is a lot more programmatic than in the industry space. I have relationships with certain target schools that we
Hmm.
work very closely with, arranging events,
Hmm.
et cetera.
Today, I really want to talk about just like interviewing do's and don'ts with Amazon. So I think I'm gonna start going with asking questions around three do's and maybe three don'ts
Mhm.
when you are or when a candidate is interviewing with Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's start with the do's and then we can go into the don'ts.
Yep.
So three do's, I'd say the first one that I want to highlight, and this one for anyone that's in like a graduate program right now, they're probably aware of it. A lot of others that have kind of been interviewing are probably aware of it too, but it's very important. And that is to use a structured response
Hmm.
format for your narratives. The most common one is called STAR. So
Yep.
if you go to Amazon.jobs and you look at we have an interviewing section with a bunch of tips. We put like right out there for everyone, use the star format.
Hmm.
I mean, star is great. I know like Georgetown University, for example, they use PAR, which is very similar. I've also heard SCAR.
I
And
actually
so
like
it's,
Star. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So it's basically like situation, task, action, result is what star is.
Yep.
The situation, the task is the context. The
Hmm.
action is what you did to
Hmm.
get from what you needed to, what the problem was to the solution. And then the result is when you tie it back together. So how did you land in terms of what your KPIs were and what actually happened? So that's it at a very high level. The reason why this is the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about interview do's is the Amazon interview process is very heavily leaning towards behavioral questions. And I would say that most companies' interview processes, except for very highly technical roles or very specialized roles, are very heavily leaning on behavioral questions. Behavioral questions are tell me about a time when blank type questions. And so what an interviewer really wants is, one, for you to do well, but two, for you to communicate clearly so that they can accurately assess you. And by using a structured format like STAR, you're then able to really clearly convey your narrative, because you're laying it all out. Here's what the situation was. Here's what I had to do. Here's everything that I did. And this is where you're really highlighting your skills, leadership principles, et cetera. And then you always have to stick the landing here. This was the result. Quantify it as best you can. Use KPIs that really illustrate the impact that you had. So yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
No, that's super important.
That would be our first do. The second one that comes to mind for me is, this is very Amazon specific. Understand our leadership principles. Like, really understand them. Again, they're listed. There's 16 of them. They are listed on our Amazon.jobs website. The reason I say this is, for one, I know this for me, I can guess it for you too, Young. I'm pretty sure both of us have spoken to and talked in leadership principles, thought in leadership principles today in our meetings. And so it's at the core of everything we do at Amazon, no matter what your role. And what's most relevant for candidates is that it's also at the core of our interview process. So if I'm interviewing you, say, as your interviewer, I'm going to have a few competencies in front of me. I'm going to have your resume in front of me. We're going to have about 45 minutes, and I'm going to need to evaluate you on those competencies. Now, for most roles, again, the exception may be highly specialized, highly technical roles, but for most roles, primarily that interview will be me looking for leadership principles. So I think that if a candidate starts this process by understanding leadership principles, and really diving into what they mean, not just like what their titles are, but like look at the definitions, look at what they mean, then look at your own narratives and see which of your narratives can speak to these leadership principles. I wouldn't say don't name drop them. It's just distracting, right? I don't know if you've interviewed and you've heard a candidate say something like, well, I was really customer obsessed in this role, and I took so much ownership here by delivering results.
I had that experience.
It's not cool. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's distracting. And at the end of the day, we just want to see you embody those leadership principles. That would be my second do. So we have STAR, we have leadership principles. The third one, and I feel like there's so many that can fit in the top three, but the third one that came to mind for me was be prepared for follow-up questions. And I think this is one where a lot of candidates, they forget this. Again, going back to the format, right? So I'm interviewing you. I have my 2 or 3 leadership principles. We've got 45 minutes. I may just ask you 2 questions. I may be looking for think big and earns trust. So I ask you a think big question, earns trust question. But the thing is, and your STAR story could just be 2 minutes, and it's a great STAR story, but it's almost never just going to end there. There are going to be a lot of follow-up questions. And this is, I think Amazon, just in my own experience, Amazon digs deeper than most companies with follow-ups.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you agree. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, with those follow-up questions, there's no way to really be prepared for any follow-up question you could get. Focus on having a very clean, tight STAR story that you can be succinct with, that you can really show your communication skills, show your impact and everything. But when it comes to follow-up questions, do anticipate them. So at this point, you've gone through the leadership principles, you develop your STAR stories, you know which STAR stories you can really illustrate leadership principles with. But now think about those STAR stories and think about what some common follow-up questions might be. You're not able to guess every one, but I'll lean on you, Young, for maybe some, because I know you probably have some that you use a lot. But for me, like the most common follow-up questions that I see or I use are like, if you're talking about leading an initiative, like what
Yeah.
did you do with pushback? Did people
Yeah.
push back, and how did
That's a
you
good
handle
one.
that?
That's a good one.
Um, how did you where did you screw up in the process, right? Like
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
went wrong? What would
That's
you do
another good
to
one.
improve it?
Yeah.
What
I
comes to mind for you?
I ask questions around like so like a lot of the times people use like we or
Mhm.
like versus I or me. So like in those kind of cases, I ask them, so what did you exactly do? And then the other ones are like, so what would you do differently if you go back in time in that exact project? Or when it comes to like finding insights and stuff, like I always ask them, so were you right about it? Like when they tell me the result and stuff, I ask them, so were you right? And like I kind of like to see like how they react because like I think those are really good in terms of because we don't really directly ask learn and be curious, but I think those are the ones that we can actually guess if this person have that leadership principle embedded in them. So yeah, I think these are the three most common asked questions that I usually ask.
I love those, and it's so
Yeah.
funny. Two of those threes tie directly to my three don'ts. So I will elaborate more on them. But I mean, that's so telling, right? I think we're on the same
Yeah.
page, and that
Yeah.
actually reinforces
Yeah.
those points. So I'll go into those in a second. I'll just say, yeah, absolutely, those follow-ups resonate with me. The other one that I would mention is just like on logical process, right?
Yeah.
So you may give the cleanest star story, and you talk about all of the different steps you took, the teams that you engaged, and how you got to your deliverable, right?
Yeah.
But if nothing else, the interviewer will ask why you chose to do A versus B. Were there other
Mm-hmm.
options?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you? Okay, you needed to expand your the amount of users for your app, and you decided to launch a marketing campaign. What made you decide on an
Yeah.
email marketing campaign? Why not
Exactly.
display
Yeah.
ads or
Yeah.
you know?
I think a lot of the questions sometimes for me also comes with like just making clarifying questions around like if I think there's a gap between like from A to B, like
Mhm.
how they kind of present the story, and then like if I feel like there's a gap, hey, we found out this, so we did this. Like so why did you like I think those are the questions I'll also ask too. Like so like as you said, like were those the only option, or is that the only option you had, or were there something else that you kind of evaluated and chose to do that? And I think that's another question I ask pretty frequently, actually.
Yeah, I love
Yeah,
that. I love
yeah,
how you put that, the why behind it,
yeah,
because at the end of the day, a candidate may have done something really cool,
mm-hmm.
but we want to make sure that they can do cool things when they come here as well. And
Exactly,
so
yeah,
beyond just, we want to see their thought processes basically, which is the
yes.
why. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so what are the top three don'ts?
Yeah. Okay. So, um, good segue. So the first one that I had was the I versus we, and
Mm-hmm.
absolutely, it will be a follow-up question, just like you'd noted, because again, going back to the data, we can't make a call on your abilities if we're unable to identify what
Mm,
you did or what you owned
yeah.
versus what your team did.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a simple one, but we see it all the time. And the thing is, in a business context, I'm sure we use the word we a lot. I use it more than I in a business context. I think it shows, in general, we want to be humble. We want to share our
Yep.
wins. We want to, yeah, I'm noticing how much I'm using we right now. So you have to kind of unlearn it just for the interview, because for the interview,
Exactly.
you don't need to worry about being humble.
Yep.
Of course, you don't want to be cocky or anything, but you want to just be straightforward and you want to
Yes.
share the experience. So
Yep.
practice that I versus we. Practice making it clear what you did versus
Mm-hmm.
what your team did or what they
Mm-hmm.
owned. Um, so that was one of them.
Mm-hmm. And the second
The
one?
other, yeah,
Sorry.
no worries, no worries. The other one that came to mind, I think you touched on this a little bit too in your follow-ups, is don't sugarcoat your failures. I,
Mm,
I remember I think this was my first or second interview when I was an MBA student.
yeah.
I was hit with this like really blunt question where the interviewer just asked me, "Tell me about a time when you screwed up." And I was like, "Well, that was really upfront." And I'm pretty sure I just stumbled through an answer that was probably just barely adequate. But
Yeah.
since then, I've learned the proper tactic for when you're asked that. Either you're asked it like I was asked, or you maybe asked it as a follow-up question, right? Like you were saying, what went wrong? Like,
Yeah.
was this the right decision? If not,
Yeah.
like, what kind of broke in this process? So since then, I feel like there's a three-step process to this. One is to be clear. You don't need to beat yourself up about it, but you
Hmm.
also don't want to like avoid taking responsibility for anything
Hmm.
that maybe broke or went wrong or
Yeah.
just didn't go according to plan. But you don't want to stop there because we all learn from these experiences. So make sure you're ready to speak to what you learned from that failure or uh, that hiccup.
Yeah.
And then the third piece, if it's relevant, is to talk about what you did going forward to
Ah.
avoid that situation happening again. Like, did you was there a bug in the system of the product that you had created that was causing some friction for your customers? But then you identified the bug, you noted why it happened, you learned how to avoid it going forward. But did you put a patch in? Because if you did, you should
Hmm.
definitely mention it.
Hmm.
And how did that affect your product's ability to scale or other products?
Yeah.
Or maybe this was a process thing, and you wrote an SOP and you shared that with your team. I mean, that's a win. And you could talk about how much that scaled up, how many teams that impacted, perhaps how that impacted some KPIs or some numbers. So that's what I would say as kind of like a good tactic for when you get one of those questions.
Yeah, I really like that. I think when you try to tell a story about, hey, I'm too of a perfectionist, like those kind of failure story, it like you like people can really tell, like, hey, like
Yeah,
this isn't a really failure story, like
yeah,
they know that you're just trying to sugarcoat it versus tell you the actual story.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. My
So
only flaw is that I work too hard, right? It's like you got to hold in your
love those.
laughter. Get
Yeah,
one of
I
those.
heard one of those. Yeah, I actually heard
Yeah,
one of those, and like, oh,
yeah.
I'm a too perfectionist, and I was like, good for you.
Yeah, good for you. Good for
Yeah,
you. I wish I was
yeah,
perfect too. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we've got two don'ts. My third one, and honestly, like I've sat in at this point hundreds of debriefs,
yeah.
and I've heard a lot of reasons why candidates weren't hired. And I would say probably consistently, like across
Um,
job profiles, the most common one is the candidate not answering the question being asked, them kind of going
huh?
off on tangents and sort of rambling and not being able to come back to that question. It's very common in
Really?
case questions, even behavioral questions as well. So I do want to say one thing. Amazonian interviewers are taught and trained specifically to evaluate just on your content. So if you're nervous, that's fine. Don't worry about it. If you're like me, you get nervous in an interview and then you get nervous about being nervous and it's just like a downward spiral. So don't sweat it. Like if your voice stutters or
Yeah.
even if you ramble a bit, it's okay. But I think that when you get to a point where you are giving very long-winded answers that are outside, like not relevant to the actual question, you're wasting time. So there's not a lot of time for the interviewer to bring you back. And it also shows that perhaps you don't have the right active listening and speaking skills that are crucial for almost every role.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say really digest the question that you're being asked. Something that I do is if it's a bit of a complicated question, I will sometimes just paraphrase it back, not to stall, although it's helpful to have a few extra seconds sometimes to
Yeah.
think, but just to make sure I understand it. Just so I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding the question. Are you saying that you're asking about a time when I had a customer that was in
Mm-hmm.
a difficult situation?
Mm-hmm.
How did I manage that? It's okay to clarify what the question is also. What do you mean by customer? I've
Mm-hmm.
never worked in retail. Is it okay if I share a story
Mm-hmm.
where I was serving end users of my application and considering them my customer? The answer would be yes to that question, by the way, for for any behavioral question. So asking clarifying questions, really digesting what you're being asked, it's much better than just jumping into a solution that may not
Mm.
actually be answering the question.
So yeah, Balar, my last question is,
Yeah.
do you have any advice for those who are preparing for Amazon interviews in general?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to one of the do's for interviewing because I feel like this is something that a potential applicant should also do, and that is to look at our leadership principles. Now, the
Mm.
reason I say to do that this early is because it's in our DNA. Like it's how Amazon operates. And I
Yeah.
think that if you understand those leadership principles and they do not resonate with you, Amazon might not be the right place for you. And that's totally fine, right? Like every culture is different. Every
Hmm.
corporate culture is different for everybody. And so at the same time, if they really do resonate with you, I think that will put you in a good position to understand how to approach every step of your process with Amazon. So if you're, for example, reaching out to an alumni here at Amazon and having a coffee chat with them, you may want to, they may ask you a little bit about your background. I think that if you can kind of understand the leadership principles, maybe give an elevator pitch or something like that in that lens, you're going to build rapport with Amazonians if you're going that route.
Hmm.
If when you're submitting an application and you are submitting your resume, again, you don't want to drop leadership principles verbatim into a resume, but if you really understand them, you can make sure that you are illustrating them through some of your key bullet points. You can look at the job that you're applying for
Hmm.
and start thinking now about, okay, is my resume really showing these
Yeah.
aspects of my history? And so I do recommend starting with those leadership principles. But then, of course, like at the application stage, you're thinking about your resume. So beyond just leadership principles, I would also keep in mind that Amazon is not a company that puts resumes through like a software and the software spits out
Mm.
who's a good fit, who's not. Like there
Hmm.
are people that are looking at your resumes. So long as you meet basic qualifications, there's a recruiter that's going to be looking through your resumes. Now, they are trained to look and spot good resumes very quickly. And I think that an applicant should be prepared to format their resume in such a way that it is recruiter and hiring manager friendly. So not too flashy, not a whole bunch of different colors. Like honestly, for most people that are under 5 years experience, one page is all it should be.
Yes.
2 pages is okay too, but like try to be succinct, try to have your most relevant, impactful bullet points at the top. Use strong, impactful words to start off those bullet points and strong verbs. And then also just think about like the job you're applying for. So, for example, if you're applying for a TPM, your technical program manager, technical program managers work with developers. They're
Hmm.
working across functions, they're leading projects. So if you're applying for that role, make sure that you've got somewhere very clearly that you have led projects with developers working cross-functionally. Um, so you're not trying to trick an ATS, but you're trying to help a recruiter because that recruiter really wants to take your resume, pass it off to
Hmm.
the hiring manager, or put it
Yeah.
in process for interviews. So looking at that through the lens of leadership principles, just using best practices with a resume, I think these are very helpful.
Yeah.
Um, Referrals are helpful as well. So if you have people in your network that are at Amazon, or if you just want to reach out to someone and build a connection with someone at Amazon, that can be very helpful for you. It's less helpful, like it's not so necessary in student programs for those
Mm.
that are students. I would say in student programs, make a strong application, strong resume, do well in the online assessments.
Hmm.
Um, and then I would also say this is something that we're asked sometimes. Do I need a cover letter?
Mm.
No, don't need a cover letter. I think no one should be sending cover letters anywhere. I think they're like, they ask too much of a candidate. So luckily Amazon
Oh
does
yeah.
not require them.
Yeah.
But even though you don't have to write a cover letter, make sure your writing skills are sharp because a lot of
Yep.
roles require writing assessments. Almost everyone at Amazon at some point is going to be writing business docs. So like
So
your
many.
writing skills are key. You know
Yeah.
very well about that, young.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Balaram, this was awesome. This was
Yep.
really good. I think everyone probably got really good lesson about like what it really takes to interview with Amazon and succeed in interviewing with Amazon. So thank you so much and really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Anytime.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.